Most Americans do not realize they have been living on an imperial tab. That is the first truth. They think low mortgage rates, cheap imported goods, giant federal deficits, and a dollar that still buys the world us attention are just normal features of the landscape. They are not. They are billable privileges. And for roughly 50 years, the United States has been able to run up those privileges on a tab the rest of the world helped finance because the world needed dollars to buy oil. That is what the petrodollar really was, not just a technical arrangement, not just a macroeconomic footnote, a global tab. And if that tab starts getting closed, reduced, or slowly repriced, most Americans are going to feel the change long before they understand the mechanism. That is how these shifts always work. People notice the grocery bill first, then the mortgage quote, then the Treasury interest expense, then the strain in the political system. Only later do they ask what invisible support structure used to keep the whole thing easier. Cheaper and more forgiving than it otherwise would have been. That is the story I want to tell you. Because if you only see the dollar as paper, you miss everything. A paper dollar is not impressive. What made it extraordinary was the structure built around it. The structure is where the power lived, and the structure is now under pressure. The transcript you gave me understands this at a deeper level than most people discussing the subject online. It is not screaming that the dollar dies tomorrow. It is doing something more serious. It is showing how the petrodollar system gave the United States a huge hidden subsidy, how that subsidy worked through oil pricing and capital recycling, and how the slow erosion of that system could eventually show up in the form of inflation, higher rates, weaker purchasing power, and a government with less room to finance itself painlessly. It also does something important that many viral versions of this story refuse to do. It separates myth from mechanism. It says clearly that the old Saudi arrangement mattered enormously, but that the dramatic claim of a formal treaty simply expiring and killing the petrodollar in one day is too cartoonish. The real story is slower, structural, and therefore more dangerous. Fe Filocite, Fe turn 55 file 0 Fe, that is exactly the kind of story I care about. Because structural damage is what catches people who only know how to react to drama. Let us begin where the tab first opened. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the United States helped design a monetary system with the dollar at the center and the dollar itself tied to gold. At $35 an ounce, America could do that because it had the industrial strength, military dominance, and gold reserves to make the arrangement credible. It had the biggest balance sheet in the room and the metal to back the promise. That system had discipline because gold gave it discipline. A country could stretch, but it could not stretch forever without eventually feeling the constraint. The transcript walks through that foundation clearly and correctly. Fe Filocite, Fe turn 55 file 0 Fe, but discipline is what every empire eventually learns to resent. America wanted the power of reserve, currency status, and the freedom to spend like constraint was an outdated superstition. By the late 1960s, the contradiction was obvious. Vietnam. Domestic programs, dollars going abroad faster than gold, could honestly support. Foreign governments began calling the bluff and converting paper into metal. The United States was bleeding gold because the arithmetic no longer matched the claim. Then came the Nixon shock in 1971. Convertibility was cut. The gold window closed. The anchor was gone. The transcript states this plainly, and it matters because that was the moment the dollar lost its old spine and had to find a new one. Fe Filocite, Fe turn 55 file 0 Fe. This is where most people think the story becomes one of pure fiat illusion. That is not quite right. The dollar did not survive on patriotic vibes or central bank incantations alone. It survived because America built a second spine, oil. That is the hinge of the whole thing, not gold in a vault, oil in the ground. The 1973 oil embargo and the price shock that followed created both a crisis and an opening. The United States suddenly needed to preserve both its energy access and the international demand for its currency after gold backing was gone. The transcript describes Henry Kissinger's move toward Saudi Arabia and the 8th of June 1974 Blair House Agreement as the moment the next architecture took shape. Saudi Arabia would price oil in dollars and recycle the resulting surpluses into American assets, especially treasuries. While the United States would provide security, arms, and regime support, whether every internet myth about a secret 50-year clause is true is beside the point. The mechanism was real. Other OPEC countries followed. Oil moved into dollar pricing. Dollar demand became welded to energy demand. The tab reopened under a different name. Fe-Felicite Fe-Turn 55 File 0 Fe. That was a brilliant substitution. The world did not need dollars because dollars were beautiful. The world needed dollars because modern economies needed oil. And if oil was sold in dollars, then dollars became the admission ticket to industrial life. This is where the metaphor of the imperial tab becomes useful. Imagine one nation sitting in the best seat in the room, ordering aggressively, running military commitments, social promises, imported consumption, and chronic deficits, while much of the world keeps showing up not only to accept the same currency but to recycle that currency back into the tab holder's debt market. That is what the petrodollar system did. It let America write iOS in the language everyone else still needed for basic economic respiration. That is a level of privilege so large that most people living inside it stop seeing it as privilege at all. They call it normal. The transcript makes the loop beautifully clear. Countries need dollars to buy oil. Gulf exporters collect huge piles of those dollars. Instead of hoarding them under mattresses, they recycle a large portion back into U.S. treasuries and other U.S. financial assets. The dollars go out for energy and come back to fund America. This is not just trade. It is a financing loop. It is a self-reinforcing monetary pump. The source then quantifies the privilege. The dollar still touches nearly 90% of global FX transactions. Roughly 80% of oil trades are still in dollars. Economists estimate the annual value of this reserve, currency privilege to the U.S. economy, at around $225 billion to $270 billion. That is not symbolic. That is a giant invisible subsidy. Fe-Felicite Fe-Turn 55 File 0 Fe. Invisible subsidies are the most politically useful kind. Nobody needs to vote for them. Nobody receives a bill-stamped global reserve advantage. But people feel them: cheaper borrowing, deeper treasury demand, lower interest costs than a normal debtor would deserve, more room for deficits, more room for war, more room for fiscal indulgence without immediate punishment. That is why the petrodollar mattered, not because it was a neat diplomacy anecdote from the 1970s, because it helped create the conditions under which America could live beyond what a normal country with its debt habits would otherwise be allowed to get away with. This is why I keep coming back to the tab. A tab is useful because the pain of payment is postponed. That is what America enjoyed. The world kept financing the bar. Now, here is the problem with tabs. They work only as long as the room still agrees to honor them. If enough people in the room decide they want alternatives, the tab holder does not necessarily collapse overnight. But the terms begin changing. The limit gets tighter. The interest gets higher. The forgiveness gets thinner. That is exactly the process the transcript describes. At first, the erosion was slow enough to look harmless. The dollar's share of global reserves slid from about 85% in the 1970s to around 72% by the early 2000s, and then toward roughly 57% by 2025. Still dominant, still enormous, but no longer monopolistic. In the old sense, the source is careful here, and that care is intellectually important. This is not a story about instant replacement. It is a story about monopoly drifting toward competition. Fe-Felicite Fe-Turn 55 File 0 Fe, that is the right phrase. Monopoly drifting toward competition, because that is where real economic pressure is born. A reserve currency monopoly lets you write huge tabs. A reserve currency leader facing more competition has to start thinking more like everyone else. That is a massive change, even if the leader remains first. Then came the deeper fracture. Most reserve systems survive on more than convenience. They survive on neutrality, or at least on the belief in neutrality. A country is willing to hold another country's liabilities at scale if it believes those liabilities remain usable, even in ugly political weather. That is where 2022 changed the psychology. The transcript points to the freezing of Russian reserves and the removal from SWIFT as the catalytic moment. You do not need to defend Russia to understand the lesson. Every treasury ministry in the world watched that move and learned the same thing. Dollar reserves were not just liquid, safe claims. They were claims embedded in a geopolitical system willing to weaponize access. That realization does not force immediate revolution, but it permanently changes the risk model. Reserves once assumed to be politically neutral are no longer experienced as neutral. Fay file site Fay turn 55 file 0 Fay. That is the point at which a slow erosion becomes strategic. Countries start looking for exits, not because they can replace the dollar tomorrow, but because they have learned they should not be fully trapped inside one system forever. The transcript gives the path of those exits in detail. China launched yuan-denominated oil futures. Its SIPS payments architecture expanded to thousands of banks across many countries. Russia-China trade moved overwhelmingly into yuan and rubles. India and the UAE settled some energy transactions outside the dollar. Project Membridge demonstrated real cross-border settlements without touching SWIFT or the dollar. Saudi Arabia, the original keystone of the 1970s arrangement, joined that platform in 2024. France itself did an LNG transaction in yuan. None of these alone kills the dollar. Together they say something very sober. The room is building side doors. Fay felicite, Fay turn 55 file 0 Fay. That is why I prefer the metaphor of a slowly closing tab to all the hysterical end. Of the dollar language, because the strongest systems do not usually die first through public humiliation. They lose exclusivity, they lose automaticity, they lose the unquestioned assumption that every serious transaction must pass through them. That is enough to matter. Now let us deal with the Saudi question because the source handles it correctly and it is important not to get lazy here. There was a wave of headlines in 2024 claiming the petrodollar was officially dead because some supposed 50-year agreement expired. The transcript cuts through that myth. The formal Joint Commission expired, but public records and official clarification show there was no single formal treaty clause requiring all Saudi oil to be priced forever in dollars, the way the internet likes to imagine. The more important truth is that Saudi behavior changed at the margin, not that it flipped a switch. It continues large dollar relationships, continues big U.S. investment links, and still prices oil largely in dollars. At the same time, it is clearly more open to non-dollar options than it would have been decades ago. That is not death, it is hedging. And hedging by the original anchor state matters enormously. Fay file site Fay turn 55 file 0 Fay, because hedging is what serious players do before the crowd agrees the regime changed. That is why I pay more attention to central banks than to shouting pundits. Central banks cannot afford theatrical ideology. They move in balance, sheet language. The source notes that central banks have been buying over 1,000 metric tons of gold annually for 3 straight years. Gold's share of global reserves climbed materially. That is not just about inflation fear. It is about reserve assets that cannot be frozen by a foreign parliament, central bank, or sanctions regime. Gold has no yield. It is costly to store. It is operationally inconvenient. So when central banks buy that much of it anyway, they are telling you something very clear. They prefer an inert asset with no issuer over a politically weaponizable claim on someone else. System Fay file site Fay turn 55 file 0 Fay. That is one of the loudest silent messages in the entire global monetary system. Trust is not disappearing all at once, but the old trust monopoly is clearly thinner. And when trust thins, tabs get repriced. Now let us bring this back to ordinary Americans, because that is where too many macro discussions fail. They turn into a chessboard and never return to the kitchen table. If the petrodollar strength erodes gradually, the consequences are not just for diplomats and reserve managers. They touch daily life. The source lays out the channels clearly. First, inflation risk. One reason America could create so many dollars without suffering the same rapid inflationary consequences as a smaller economy was that the world constantly needed and absorbed those dollars. Weaken that external demand over time, and each new marginal dollar has less foreign appetite to hide inside. That means more pressure on domestic prices and purchasing power. The transcript says bluntly that what bought $100 of goods may later buy $80 or $75. The account balance can still say $1 million while the basket it buys quietly shrinks. Fay file a site, Fay turn 55 file 0 Fay second. Interest rates. If petrodollar recycling fades and if foreign official demand for treasuries keeps drifting lower, the United States has to work harder to fund itself. The source cites foreign holdings falling from above 50% of the Treasury market during the financial crisis to about 30% by early 2025. That matters because debt that must be sold to a less captive audience usually requires a more competitive yield. Higher Treasury yields flow outward into mortgages, auto loans, corporate debt, refinancing stress, and the cost of every future promise. The tab becomes more expensive. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 55 file 0 Fay third. Retirement assets. Gulf sovereign wealth money and foreign reserve flows have been meaningful participants in U.S. financial markets. If that demand base weakens at the margin, valuations and bond prices feel it. Again, not necessarily in one cinematic break, but through thinner support and a more normal price for capital. Americans who think global reserve architecture has nothing to do with their 401k are misunderstanding the machinery that helps support the valuations they take for granted. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 55, file 0 Fay fourth, geopolitical leverage. A dollar-centered world gave America something even stronger than cheap funding. It gave America the ability to project coercive power through finance itself. Sanctions work best when there is no good alternative system. The more other countries build settlement channels, reserve options, and payment infrastructure beyond the dollar, the more that lever weakens. This matters because military power and monetary privilege were never separate stories. They reinforced one another. If one begins to soften, the other becomes costlier to maintain. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 55 file 0 Fay fifth, long-run dollar purchasing power. The transcript is careful not to predict a dramatic overnight collapse. Good. I agree with that. Restraint. Erosion is the bigger story. The dollar can remain the leading reserve currency and still lose purchasing power more quickly than the average American expects. That is often how decline actually works. The number in your account does not shock you. The life it buys does. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 55, file 0 Fay. This is where the calm counter-argument deserves real respect, because unserious thinking on these topics usually comes from panic merchants and complacency merchants, both of whom are dangerous. The source acknowledges the obvious counterweight. The yuan is still a small reserve currency, under 5%, nothing close to the dollar. India explicitly says it is not trying to create a BRICS reserve currency. American capital markets remain deeper, more liquid, and more legally trusted than the alternatives. The shale revolution also changed the original energy dependence logic of the 1970s. All of that matters. It is the reason the dollar still dominates. It is why I reject collapse fantasy. The world is not replacing the dollar tomorrow with one neat rival. That is too childish for the complexity of reserve systems. Fay file site Fay turn 55 file 0 Fay, but acknowledging the strength of the incumbent does not negate the direction of the change. That is the key. The dollar can remain first and still become less monopolistic. America can remain powerful and still lose some financing privilege. A system can stay dominant and still become less forgiving. That is often exactly how history moves, not from alive to dead in one jump, from unquestioned to questioned, from exclusive to competitive, from subsidized to more honestly priced. That is why the phrase I keep returning to is simple. The petrodollar is not dead, but the tab is getting reviewed. And if you have lived your whole life inside a country whose debt, imports, lifestyle, and policy flexibility were all made easier by that tab, then a review matters, even if the credit line is not cut off tomorrow. This is why I think the most honest way to approach your own financial life is not to ask whether the dollar wins. That is too simplistic. Ask instead how exposed you are to one monetary architecture remaining as generous, liquid, and globally compulsory as it was in the peak monopoly years. The transcript offers the right practical questions. How concentrated are your savings in dollar-only assets? How dependent is your income on low inflation? How vulnerable are you to rising rates, especially through adjustable debt? Those are not apocalyptic questions. They are adult questions. They accept that gradual erosion still changes planning. They accept that preserving purchasing power requires more than patriotic faith in the green paper itself. Fay Philocite, Fay Turn 55 File 0 Fay. I would go even further. You should stop measuring safety by nominal account balances alone. $1 million that buys 20% less is not still $1 million. In any way that matters to real life, you should stop assuming reserve. Currency privilege is a natural resource rather than a geopolitical financial arrangement whose terms can weaken. You should stop imagining that foreign reserve managers owe the U.S. Treasury eternal loyalty independent of political risk. And you should certainly stop thinking that because the process is slow, it is therefore trivial. Slow processes are the ones that reshape nations while citizens are still busy calling them temporary. That is what I find most fascinating about this story. The petrodollar was one of the great quiet constructions of modern power. Most Americans never saw it. They never voted on it. They never signed it. Yet it shaped the affordability of their debt, the resilience of their government's deficits, the purchasing power of their savings, and the global demand for the paper in their wallets. Now, the same system is thinning in a way most of them will also fail to see directly. That is why understanding matters. Not because knowledge is decorative, because confusion gets expensive when the subsidy starts shrinking. So here is the final choice. You can keep treating the dollar's old privilege like weather and assume the room will always breathe the same way it has for decades. Or you can understand that what kept the room easy to breathe was a very specific architecture tying oil trade, reserves, and U.S. debt into one enormous belief structure, and that this architecture is now facing strategic diversification from countries that no longer want their future fully trapped inside it. One path feels simpler, the other is truer, and truth matters because gradual erosion punishes the lazy more than the alert. If the petrodollar were going to collapse overnight, panic would be enough because it is more likely to erode over years. Clarity is what matters. Clarity about purchasing power, clarity about rates, clarity about concentration, clarity about the difference between dominance and immortality. America built an extraordinary system in 1974. That system bought the country time, power, leverage, and a scale of financial privilege few empires ever enjoyed. But privilege becomes dangerous when the people living on it start mistaking it for a law of nature. It was never a law of nature, it was a deal. And the more the world builds exits from that deal, the more every American saver, borrower, investor, and taxpayer needs to understand one simple thing. When the global tab gets tighter, the bill does not stay in Washington. Eventually, it shows up in your life.